Hello, everyone. Welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Himbar, and today I'm doing another fantasy essay video. It's been a couple months since I've done one of these, and this is one of my favorite series or playlists that I have on my channel. I just look at things that are, well, generally essays or lectures that relate to fantasy. They're normally written by fantasy authors. In fact, I think they've all been so far. I have one today that's a little different, though, because essentially it's an advertisement, to be completely honest, right? Um, and that is, of course, Sword and Sorcery is a Game 2 by Gary Gygax. And this is something I actually, well, it was mentioned in this, The Elusive Shift by John Peterson. How role-playing games forge their identity. And this is essentially a book that I've had for several years, actually, um, talking about how a game that was labeled as a war game got the label of role-playing game. In fact, I think that's what Dungeons and Dragons labels itself of as now, right? As the world's greatest role-playing game, I think. And I am a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons, right? I need a Harper's pin here instead of this one. And I'm wearing one of my D&D shirts today. Um, we'll get into a little bit of present, like 5th edition stuff, a little bit thoughts of that later on. But I believe we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons right around this time. I couldn't find exactly when original Dungeons and Dragons was published. I know the first ads appeared in the spring of 1974. So it was probably published right around this time. I'm not sure. Maybe in January it was. I don't know. Um, Maybe someone would know. I couldn't find it out on the internet, but I did find something. Right, I found he in this book on page 20. He references this article, if you will. It's only 2 pages long, and I found it online. It took me a while, but it is SF and F Journal number 87 from February 1976. So this is about 48 years old. Um, there's a lot of stuff in the table of contents. And what's cool actually is that the cover, which I don't have to show you right now, but I'll link this below. The cover is actually done by Gary Gygax himself. Actually, we have that at the end of the table of contents. It says, and it's copyright by Donald L. Miller. I don't know if this is something more like an APA. What exactly this is? I mean, it says it's a journal. Peterson in the book labels it more as a newsletter. But the article itself is on page A7 and A8. So I'll scroll back down to that real quick because I'm just looking at this on my computer. All right, so Swords and Sorcery is a game too. I just thought this would be interesting because one, it's the 50th anniversary of Dungeons and Dragons, but I also came to Sword and Sorcery, which is one of my favorite genres, through Dungeons and Dragons. I hope my lighting and like my angles okay. I'm filming this during the day, which I almost never do these days. Um, and so here's the opening line, basically. It says, many fantasy novels and stories relate epic battles and give detailed histories of the mythical world upon which such action takes place. This sort of fare is meat and drink to the devotee of wargaming. But until about 2 years ago, there wasn't much he could do to put this imaginative action and creation into his body. Similarly, the swords and sorcery buff was unable to do much more than read. And then cue the advertisement, right? This all changed when Dungeons and Dragons came, right? I mean, and he's not wrong in a way. I don't know much about the history of wargaming, right? And that's a little bit out of my wheelhouse. Now, I do enjoy Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like I said, and when you read something like Appendix N, most of the books in there are what you'd categorize as sword and sorcery. He does use the label fantasy and sword and sorcery not to mean the same thing here. So he does kind of go on to like again, it's a little like an ad at first, right? There's fighter, magic user, cleric, or thief, and kind of what those come about. He does abbreviate D ampersand D. Dungeon Master is no space in between those. He calls it a referee first says as well. So we also use taint. It ain't, I think, is what taint is, which is interesting. I thought, just as someone who likes words, but on the second page is where you get a lot more of the meat. I feel like because the first page is almost just D&D advertisement, right? Which is interesting in of itself. It's nice to see what D&D was thought of pretty early in its conception, right? This is after very few supplements. I think Greyhawk and Blackmoor had been released, but this is before any other version of D&D, right? Not Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, not Basic Dungeons and Dragons, just Dungeons and Dragons. So we do get at the top of the second page, though, that you do have you have campaigns, right, which can be based off like the words of JRTT, which I think should be JRRT, I think is what he means, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, or HPL, which is of course H.P. Lovecraft. They are, it says, are writ to the extravagant fantasia of comic book characters in magic, which is interesting. Fantasia of comic book characters. That's actually one of my complaints about 5th edition these days, is that the characters feel much too much like superheroes, and they're really hard to kill. No, I mean, of course you could kill them pretty easily. A DM can do whatever they want, but I mean, like, they just feel a lot like superheroes, which I'm not a huge fan of. So the nice thing also, though, is that these are just kind of rules that you can modify. So when you're speaking of Dungeons and Dragons, I do modify it so it feels less superhero-y if I'm playing 5th edition, though my preferred thing would actually be something like Castles and Crusades, which is more like AD&D. You know, third edition is kind of gamey. 4th edition is not very Dungeons and Dragons, and 5th edition is just kind of overpowered. The characters are, but that's just my 2 cents. Anyways, so basically he gets on here. Then how did he come about to creating Dungeons and Dragons? He says him and Dave Arneson were avid readers of imaginative literature. They're both amateur historians. And then he says, of course, games and game playing are their primary hobby interests, which is interesting that he's like referring to himself in the third person, because he says both authors of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So it's their primary hobby interest, not his and Dave's, it's theirs, right? Anyways, from a background of childhood fairy tales and such, through a study of various mythologies and a welter of fantasy and swords and sorcery stories, D&D was born. And that's like the big thing, right? It's like it's sword and sorcery. Like if you look at Appendix N, right, which is the stories in the first, I think, Dungeon Master's Guide, where he's basically like, this is the stuff that inspired it. Now, albeit, right, that came out in 1979. Okay, but he's saying it here in 1976, so that's a few years earlier. He does give an Appendix N, by the way, which I will share with you in a minute. And he, if you look at the list, right, like Tolkien kind of gave a lot of physical content, and I feel like, to Dungeons and Dragons, like with like halflings and stuff like that, and elves and dwarves. But a lot of the feel of it, especially when you're playing humans, which is a lot of the earlier stuff, is feels very sword and sorcery. Now it's changed over the years, and you'll get certain things like Dragonlance feels much more Tolkien-esque. Forgotten Realms feels a little bit more sword and sorcery-esque, and that's because of where their origins lie, right? So it kind of depends on where you are in Dungeons and Dragons. I think they're both pretty closely related. Dungeons and Dragons is definitely a version of heroic fantasy, and at times is almost completely sword and sorcery, but at other times is very much not, right? But I think initially, right, as this says here, that it is essentially sword and sorcery gaming. That's the idea of it, which, you know, I think you could argue against more now, but here in this only 2 years since its conception, now is essentially what Gygax is saying. So that's cool to know. I think it's interesting to know. So it says it arose from a combination of warfare with miniature figures and the desire to create heroic epics of the strange and supernatural. In no particular order, I mentioned some of the authors who most strongly influenced its creation. So this is basically the Appendix N, right? And I think I didn't actually double check my Appendix N. I have, but I think these all were probably mentioned Appendix N, with maybe like 1 or 2 exceptions. I'm not entirely sure, because again, I didn't double check. But A Merit for fantasy and super science. Sorry. Lovecraft for horrible alien gods, Howard for the superhero, Leiber for the adventure on parallel Earths, DeCamp and Pratt for treating myths and mythos as adventure, Paul Anderson for the heroic quest, Tolkien for the complete epic, Vance for magic and imagination, so he admits that there, which we all know is true at this point. So Burroughs for the pit adventure. I'm not entirely sure what he means there, but as well as Brackett, Farmer, St. Clair, Fox, Haggard, Pataya, I don't know who that is, and Saberhagen. And so that's essentially like an early Appendix N, which is interesting, right? And nice, again. And currently, he says D&D is spreading through the wargaming hobby very rapidly, at the same time making inroads amongst college students and sword and sorcery fans. And that is an early demographic, I feel like, of people who enjoyed Dungeons and Dragons, right? You got these sword and sorcery fans. You literally have Moorcock, Fisher, and Leiber, who kind of support this as well. And I think maybe Lynn Carter kind of vaguely did as well. And But the college students one is interesting, and also these wargaming things. Like wargaming, in some ways, is you control more than one person, right? And so controlling a single person had actually been done before. I don't know if the creators of D&D were aware of it because it was done by like male gaming, so it was very slow, not done around a table. But that this book, The Elusive Shift, will talk about that. And then it does mention that D&D is campaign gaming, where progression rather than winning per se is the object, which in some ways is also different, I feel like, than wargaming, which, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea generally is army pitted against army, right? Something more like Warhammer 40K these days, or just Warhammer or any other game like that, right? You don't win in D&D, you just progress, right? That's the idea. And most of this progression, at least back in the day, was by loot, right? Gold, but I mean, still, it's a progression. Also, I mean, like you see a lot of that in sword and sorcery literature as well. A lot of these sword and sorcery stories are serialized or they're just short story format. So you get these characters, in some ways they progress, right? Throughout the stories, like Conan becomes king, even though the first Conan story already is king. But I digress. Right. And so like or in Liber, they just get old. They don't really win anything. Right. There's no greater cosmic thing they are battling against that they win the day, like some epic fantasy thing. And it says, additionally, if some of the swords and sorcery authors get their hands into this aspect of gaming, and Lynn Carter has recently done so by co-authoring a work on war games in the Hyborian Age. Hyborian Age here is spelled R-E-A-N, though. And it could achieve national attention. I think it looks like notional. Anyways, national makes more sense. For D&D, with its progenitor Chainmail, of course, and its fantasy supplement, is unquestionably the granddaddy of them all. So D&D is already the granddaddy of them all, which I think this book also talks about how in like 1980, people were already saying that there was like third generation role-playing games. That's 6 years after Dungeons & Dragons, and there's already third generation role-playing games. That's a little ridiculous. But again, I'm not the wargaming expert here. That's just funny that D&D is the granddaddy of them all, and it's been out for 2 years. And it will be hard to displace as the most popular sword and sorcery game. That's what it says. Now, sitting 50 years later, right, or 48 years from when this was written, D&D probably is still the most popular tabletop role-playing game. It's not the first one I ever played, right, but it's probably still the most popular one. It's the one I play the most often, or at least a variant of, because even something like Castle and Crusades has the open game license. It's very similar to AD&D, right? And he kind of even says, actually, that is because of the variety you can have with it, right? I mean, like, you can do so many things. In fact, he even says that you could do like stuff with modern technology, or a post-atomic war Earth, or sprinkled with true science fiction, or any historical period, right? And you can make D&D rules work. Now, D&D rules are very different back then. This is the most basic of D&D rules ever, but even AD&D does kind of have a system like that, or at least I think of more on like Castle and Crusades. I would not play 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons for any sci-fi thing ever. Like, I wouldn't, or even for a historical thing, I would not. But I could do Siege Engine, which is what Castle and Crusades uses, right? And the Siege Engine also has their Amazing Adventures, right? They're basically the same system, but one is not Dungeons and Dragons fantasy-esque, right? So, I mean, that concept has been retained by some people. You kind of lose that with 3rd edition, I feel like, which even dropped the advanced notion. But again, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons wasn't even a thing at this time, anyways. But because of those comparisons to other genres, he says in this regard, it's a true fantasy game rather than a strict swords and sorcery game. It's interesting because I think the idea is sword and sorcery. That's most of the base, but fantasy also is there, right? I mean, you'd be really hard pressed to call Tolkien sword and sorcery. I mean, you kind of get that lumped in the early 70s and the 60s and stuff. Before that, you could generally call fantasy sword and sorcery because that was the biggest form of fantasy at the time. It wasn't until Tolkien and then his imitators came that you really got, in a lot of ways, more different types of fantasy, like epic fantasy. But I mean, heck, one of the suggestions for the title of Sword and Sorcery was epic fantasy, by the way. That was Moorcock's suggestion. Liber is the one who suggested Sword and Sorcery. So we could be living in a very different genre world right now, and genres are a little iffy anyways. But so it is interesting, right? He recognizes like it's mostly Sword and Sorcery, hence the title of the article, but there's some stuff in there that's not. In fact, he says Hobbitish is one of the characters you play are Hobbitish characters. Um, but but it's like if you are a true Swords and Sorcery fan, it is quite likely that you will enjoy Dungeons and Dragons. I wonder how true that is today. I feel like for these early versions of Dungeons and Dragons, though, that was almost guaranteed. Personally, I'm a big fan of Sword and Sorcery, and I love things akin to it that work well in Dungeons and Dragons. Again, 5th edition doesn't have that so much these days. You go play a lot of other stuff like Morkborg, Shadow Dark, Astonishing Swordsman, Sorcerers, Hyperborea, Swords Against Wizardry. I mean, there's Castle Crusades even. I mean, there's a lot, right? Lots of different versions out there of these tabletop games that are pretty much D&D-esque, even Dungeon Crawl Classics, right? So it does say, though, he closes with this, as a word of warning, however, it is advised that you approach the game with extreme caution, for it is highly addictive and hazardous to the pursuit of most other activities. On the bright side, it seems to be nearly as enjoyable to females as it is to males, which I think is an interesting note. I don't know much about the history of how women interacted with D&D, but that's an interesting note. Again, like I said, very early on in D&D's history. I find that interesting, at least. And then the very last sentence is actually, those who don't always play the game are usually writing articles about it, and hence why he was writing this article about it. So again, that is Swords and Sorcery is a game 2 by Gary Gygax, again found on pages A7 and A8 from was issue 87 of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Journal, which also had another name, actually. I let's mention it here. It says formerly the WSFA Journal. I think it actually was known. I don't know what the WSFA stands for. I believe it was actually only called the Science Fiction and Fantasy Journal for a few issues, and I think it went back to WSFA. So interesting stuff. Again, I will share this down below if anyone wants to look at it. Let me know your thoughts. I mean, even though I'm not the biggest fan of 5th edition, and Wizards of the Coast has some problems recently, I do really like Dungeons and Dragons, right? I'm a big fan of it, and I'm glad that it's made it to 50 years. Hopefully it makes it to another 50 years. It's crazy. It was about this time last year I made the 100 Years of Weird Tales video on the 100th anniversary of Weird Tales first hitting newsstands. And here we are 50 years in Dungeon Dragons. It's crazy to think that after 50 years after Weird Tales hit the shelves, that Dungeons Dragons did too. That's all recent history in reality. So anyways, let me know what you think down below. I do really need to get a Harper's pen, though. Maybe I'll get one of those. But Liam from Liam's Lyceum, I will catch you next time.